You're listening to Uptown Radio. It's April 7th. I'm Emily Dugdale.
And I'm Catherine Sullivan. The world is watching Donald Trump after he ordered a strike on a Syrian airbase last night. Author Diana Dark says his motives are not as simple as he claims.
Why now? Why suddenly now? Is it really just about this sarin gas attack and the fact that Trump has seen images that have moved him?
City planners have proposed rezoning the garment district. For longtime businesses, this is unwelcome news.
They're looking to take our real estate and take the industry and basically eliminate it.
Days after a train derailment threw Penn Station into a tailspin, New Jersey Transit passengers say service is still not back to normal.
Certain days it'll be empty in there, and then now you'll see, like when they get off the train, it'll be packed. I guess that's because of delays.
We'll also hear about a proposal to lower the voting age in New York and the man who turned the rainbow flag into the symbol of a movement. But first, the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. The U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, says the Trump administration was fully justified when it fired missiles at a Syrian airfield. Russia, though, calls it an act of aggression, as NPR's Michelle Kellerman reports.
U.S. officials say they were targeting the airfield that Syria used to launch a chemical weapons attack this week. Ambassador Haley says the U.S. is ready to do more to ensure that the Syrian regime never uses chemical weapons again.
The United States will not stand by when chemical weapons are used. It is in our vital national security interest to prevent the spread and use of chemical weapons.
Haley is urging Russia to end its, quote, misplaced alliance with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Russia, though, is denouncing the U.S. action and suspending so-called deconfliction talks with the U.S. military in Syria. Michelle Kellerman, NPR News, Washington.
Trump's decision marks a dramatic shift from 2013, when his political career had scarcely begun. At the time, the president publicly appealed to then-President Obama not to get involved in Syria militarily. But since his election, President Trump has blamed the current state of affairs in Syria in part on what he described as inaction by his predecessor. Despite Syria's continued denial that it ever used chemical weapons, the U.S. military fired 59 missiles at the Shayrat air base as a message to the Assad regime. The Syrian military says at least 7 people were killed. The extent of the damage is unknown, but today, Syrian warplanes reportedly were taking off from the air base, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Russia says it is committed to reinforcing Syria's air defense system. Neil Gorsuch is confirmed as the newest Associate Justice on the U.S. Supreme Court by a Senate vote today of 54-45. NPR's Carrie Johnson reports the Colorado judge will fill a seat that's been vacant for nearly 14 months.
Lawmakers voted largely along party lines to confirm Neil Gorsuch as the 113th Justice on the Supreme Court. The floor vote follows a political tug-of-war where Republicans broke with tradition and changed Senate rules to allow justices to be confirmed by a simple majority. The nomination proved controversial with Democrats, still angry that President Barack Obama's choice for the vacancy, Merrick Garland, never got a Senate hearing. Gorsuch is a former Justice Department official who sat on the federal appeals court in Colorado more than 10 years. His confirmation comes in time for Gorsuch to hear more than a dozen cases this term, including a high-profile test of religious freedom. Carrie Johnson, NPR News, Washington.
Before the closing bell, U.S. stocks were trading lower, with the Dow off 7 points at 20,656. The Nasdaq was off a point at 5877. S&P was down nearly 2 points at 2355. This is NPR News.
In New York, I'm Meg Dalton. It's been a week since the deadline for the state budget passed, and members of the Republican-led Senate are considering a possible resolution to the political stalemate. The Democrat-led Assembly says it's willing to support a compromise on the 3 key issues: raising the age of adult criminal responsibility, affordable housing tax credits, and funding for charter schools. Mayor Bill de Blasio doesn't have a vote on the budget, but he has concerns about the issue of school funding. He was on the Brian Lehrer Show this morning.
I believe in traditional public schools. Charters have a role to play, and we will certainly work with them. But the notion of favoring them further in funding is troubling to me.
It's still not clear when they'll meet next. Several lawmakers have already left for Passover Easter break. A Staten Island judge says the city can destroy personal documents used to apply for the city's identification program, NYC ID. The program gives ID cards to residents who may have trouble obtaining regular IDs, like undocumented immigrants, the formerly incarcerated, and transgender people. 2 Republican Assembly members are planning to appeal the decision. They say purging these documents could be a threat to national security. Things are almost back on track at Penn Station after Monday's train derailment. Amtrak restored service to all tracks, and commuters can expect a smoother ride home during tonight's evening rush. Amtrak's president and CEO, Wick Moorman, personally apologized for the inconvenience at a press conference yesterday.
It's our job to make sure that all of the passengers, both on Amtrak and on our commuter partners, can travel safely and reliably.
We'll have more on the long-term effects of Monday's derailment coming up. In other transit news, 16 subway lines will be affected by service changes this weekend. Right now, it's 47 degrees and cloudy in New York City, but this weekend you might want to grab your shades. It's going to be sunny with a high of 63 degrees. Meg Dalton, Columbia Radio News.
Last night, President Trump ordered a strike on a Syrian airbase. This was in response to President Bashar al-Assad's gas attack that killed 80 Syrian civilians on Wednesday. He addressed the nation from his estate in Mar-a-Lago late last night, calling Assad's actions barbaric and criticizing the way Syria has been dealt with in the past.
It's the first time Trump has ordered military action since taking office. Diana Dark is the author of My House in Damascus, an inside view of the Syrian crisis. She's lived and worked in the Middle East for over 30 years and is now based in London. We talked to her about how we got to this point and what to expect in the coming days.
We've gone full circle, basically. Yes, from everything looking as if Assad was going to be gradually rehabilitated by both Europe and America. And suddenly, because of this sarin attack on the town of Khan Sheikhoun, which is in Idlib province, where all the rebels are kind of corralled, suddenly the sight of little beautiful babies, as he's called them, seems to have moved President Trump so much that he's decided within the space of a few hours to just unilaterally take out the airbase from which the sarin gas attack was carried out.
And what do you think the possible immediate consequences of the U.S.'s military action in the region could be?
Well, Assad will be wanting, having had a kind of rap over the knuckles, if you like, having something that's for the first time is actually being challenged. So now he's going to want to be defiant. His initial automatic reaction is going to be to carry out more airstrikes, I'm sure. In fact, there have been rumours that there is a big offensive planned against the rebels in Idlib province, because, as I said, this is where they're all being gathered. And so now they're all sitting there waiting their fate, literally.
We learned as a result of this attack, Russia has suspended a pretty key agreement between the U.S. and Russia to cooperate on the ground in Syria. What has changed now in the U.S.-Russia relationship, and what do you think will be the consequence of this decision?
Well, personally, I wouldn't take any of that seriously. I think it's largely posturing. As I said, it's all what they've seen. They've got to be seen to be doing something. So the Russians have got to be seen to be standing up to America in some way. But it's interesting, when you look at Russian TV and the RT website, it's actually not being that vocal about it all. It's putting up a bit of a sort of defiance, but not real outrage. And don't forget, Rex Tillerson is actually going to Moscow very, very soon. I think the coming days are going to show whether Russia and America really can, reach some sort of understanding about Assad and what that might be. And, who knows where that's going to lead.
What has stood out the most in the sequence of events that's happened this week?
Why now? Why suddenly now? Is it really just about this sarin gas attack and the fact that Trump has seen images that have moved him? I mean, because every day people are killed all over Syria and all sorts of atrocities. And then suddenly, because of Trump's, just incredible unpredictability, everything has changed. Suddenly, Assad is no longer tolerable. Personally, I'm delighted because I've been saying right from the beginning that the West has got to do something because the Assad regime will never change.
And what is your prediction of how this situation is going to play out over the next week?
Well, I wish I had a crystal ball. I wish I could see where Syria would be in a month's time and a year's time. All I can say is that at every stage in this war, everybody has been wrong about what they've predicted. Everybody. And the one thing that I've said right from the beginning, and I think I would still say, is that when people say, how many more people have to die and how much more time will it take, the answer to both those questions is the same, much longer than anybody thinks. And I fear it's still not going to be over quickly. This is just the latest twist in an incredibly complex situation where nobody wants to lose face. Everybody's got different conflicting interests, and of course, it's all at the expense of the Syrian people. I mean, their country's being used like a playground, essentially, for competing rivalries and battles.
Diana Dark, author of My House in Damascus, thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you very much.
Turning 18 is a milestone for a lot of reasons. You can join the army, you can buy a lottery ticket, and you can vote. But now, State Assemblyman Robert Carroll is introducing a bill that would lower the voting age. Written with the help of 3 high school students, the bill would make it legal for New Yorkers to vote in statewide elections at 17. Max Houtman has more.
Kenny Zhang is 19 and grew up in Bensonhurst. He started volunteering in his neighborhood when he was a freshman in high school, and a few months ago, he helped found Young Democrats of South Brooklyn.
The main basis behind it was that we wanted to bring people together and to kind of raise awareness, especially for the younger generations, that politics is kind of for everyone.
Civic engagement's important to the group, and Kenny Zhang wants to pass that down to kids who were sitting where he was just a few years ago, a sentiment that Susan Zhuang, another of the group's founders, shares.
We want to get kids involved in the community. Beware, voting is very important for everyone, for every age also. People think that's adult only. It's not.
Kenny Zhang and Susan Zhuang both say that teenagers follow politics more closely than you might think. After all, issues like immigration or education affect them just as much as adults. Alex Karakne-Pallas is president of the National Youth Rights Association, and he says it's critical that civic engagement begin before kids turn 18. Only about half of eligible 18 to 29-year-olds voted last November.
People say all the time that kids getting started on bad habits when they're young because they'll continue to do that throughout life. But yet voting is a good habit that we want people to get started when they're young.
Karakne-Pallas says 18 is too old to start voting because it's when many teenagers are on their own for the first time. 16 or 17 would be better because teens are still rooted in family and community. In the U.S., only 2 small towns in Maryland have lowered the voting age to 16 for some local elections. But it's happened in larger cities in Europe, like Hanover, Germany, and Graz, Austria. And in all of those places, participation rates for 16-year-olds have been higher than 18 to 24-year-olds. And as Karakne-Pallas says, if an uninformed 30-year-old can vote, why not a smart 16-year-old?
Adults are, unfortunately, notoriously ignorant. Nobody takes a maturity test or asks adults to take a civics test.
Meanwhile, not far from the headquarters of Young Democrats of South Brooklyn.
I remember sitting there thinking, if an ordinary guy, well, he's not ordinary because he's rich, but politically speaking, he's pretty ordinary. If an ordinary guy like Donald Trump can get into office and try to help America, why can't I start a club for teen Republicans in New York City?
That's 16-year-old Batya Goldberg. Brooklyn Teen Republicans started this past January with 5 members, and it's tripled in size since then. She's been volunteering with local political campaigns for almost a year. Like a lot of teenagers, she has some pretty strong opinions.
Teenagers my age are much more knowledgeable about politics and about the political process than they were in the past. This past election, teenagers were following the campaign, even if it was through Snapchat or Instagram.
Back at Young Democrats of South Brooklyn, how do Kenny Zhang and Susan Zhuang feel about getting the chance to vote at 17?
Especially with the younger group, they get excited at things that if they can have, voting would be exciting for them.
If they're ready to vote, they're ready to vote.
Batya Goldberg's eager to vote too, but she says she'd like to see kids getting a better civics education before they cast a ballot. Carolyn O'Neill works with Generation Citizen. It provides civics classes to New York City public school students.
Civics education really is lacking in our schools today. And I think that some of the impacts of that are that you see citizens participating in really low numbers.
But when given the chance, O'Neill says teenagers are eager to get involved.
When we get into the classroom with our students, they are so passionate, talking about the real issues that are affecting them every day.
Batya Goldberg again.
I hope to be an inspiration for other teenagers to want to open clubs such as mine. And I hope that as time goes on, more and more teenagers will find themselves involved in the political process and understanding it.
Batya Goldberg won't be able to vote for 2 more years, But that could change if Robert Carroll's Youth Voter Act passes. He's headed to Albany in May to lobby support for the bill. Max Hauptman, Columbia Radio News.
Public transit doesn't meet the needs of every New Yorker. For residents who use a wheelchair, getting around can be tough. The city is in talks with car services like Uber and Lyft to put as many as 1,000 wheelchair-accessible vehicles on the road, enough for everyone who needs one.
That could solve a problem with the program the city currently relies on, Access-a-Ride. As Camila Kerwin reports, the MTA car service is saddled with problems.
For many New Yorkers, this is what public transit sounds like.
Thank you for calling Access-a-Ride. Access-a-Ride now offers an automated phone system to assist you.
To assist you, that is, with scheduling a pickup vehicle for the next day. Access-a-Ride users have to book their ride 24 hours in advance. For many, that's a nuisance. There's also an online reservations platform, but the option getting a lot of use is this one.
To give a commendation or make a complaint, please press 8.
And not for the commendation. Access-a-Ride was federally mandated by the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, but it's come under fire regularly since then. A report from the Comptroller's Office found that in 2015, drivers often arrived late or not at all. Over 30,000 riders waited for pickups that never came. And it's not like there are a lot of other options for those who need mobility assistance. Only 1 in 5 subways has elevator access. That's on a good day, when none are out of order. Serena Castillo uses Access-a-Ride because she has a mobility condition that makes it hard for her to walk and unable to work. She remembers one bad experience with a driver.
I had the right address, and on their paper, they had the wrong address. They kicked me out the car.
She's in an Access-a-Ride car right now. Maybe you've seen them around the city. They're white with blue block letters that say Access-a-Ride. She's on her way to the gym.
I mean, I count on these people, and then they do whatever they choose to do. I don't think that's right.
For passengers like Castillo, Access-a-Ride can be a constant headache. And even when the program is running smoothly, it's expensive for New York State.
It costs the MTA about $500 million a year.
Jamison Dagg is the director of the Citizens Budget Commission, which analyzes the way New York City and state government spend money. He says Access-a-Ride falls short. It's the most expensive paratransit program in the country, and not just because New York City is so big. It costs way more per trip, about double the amount of per-trip rides in Boston and San Francisco. That means the pressure to cut costs is on. One approach, reduce the amount of wheelchair-accessible vehicles.
And really, it's only about 40% of the trips that really require that intensive service.
Most riders who use Access-a-Ride are able to walk. In other words, the service has more wheelchair-accessible cars than it needs. But the proposal to roll back on accessibility has not sat well with disabilities advocates.
It's seen as controversial because it's seen as leaving a segment of the population behind.
That's Sarah Kaufman. She's an expert on paratransit at NYU's Rudin Center for Transportation. She says the controversy is valid, but she also thinks cutting back on extra wheelchair vehicles will leave more cash to improve the ones that riders need, not to mention other improvements.
There are so many parts of this that people just don't do in 2017. Not only arranging things the day before, but using a telephone, which, I don't talk on the phone very much at all.
Which is why Kaufman proposes partnering with services like Uber and Lyft and developing an app so users can schedule pickups right away. She says this kind of partnership would also be cheaper. This is especially important because New York's older population, which makes up a majority of Access-a-Ride users, is expected to grow by up to 30% by 2030.
We are going to have a large generation of seniors, and they don't just want to get to doctor's appointments, as is assumed by people who look at paratransit.
Kaufman says they want to go out with their friends, see a show, visit relatives, just like other New Yorkers. But she says the most important thing isn't just modernizing Access-a-Ride. It's improving accessibility at subway stations, too, which means more elevators that work more often. The MTA didn't respond to a request for comment for this story, but its most recent financial plan includes strategies to improve paratransit throughout the city. Camila Kerwin, Columbia Radio News.
Trains running out of New York's Penn Station are back on track, almost, after a derailment Monday morning caused widespread delays. It was the second time in as many weeks that a train derailed at Penn Station. a problem that was traced back to rotten wood timbers that support the track. This morning, the effects of Monday's derailment are lingering. Hannah Long-Higgins reports.
Penn Station is a zoo when I moved from the 1, 2, and 3 trains to the station's main hub. Even with all of the crowds, the trains are running without major delays by 8:45 a.m. But I quickly find 3 clues that tell me it may be a while before Amtrak's maintenance improvements are fully back on track.
Next time a train comes, watch how many people get off.
A Penn Station custodian named Howard Marshall reveals the first clue. I find him emptying a trash can near a Long Island Railroad train platform.
Normally just a few people around this time. Now, they cramp. You'll see.
He's referring to the packed trains that keep dropping off swarms of commuters. And sure enough, a few minutes after I talk to Marshall, a massive crowd pours out of a train and ascends the stairs from New Jersey Transit tracks 20 and 11. I step into the flow of the crowd, and together we pass the New Jersey Transit ticket counters and the Long Island Railroad waiting area, a Shake Shack, and several clusters of MTA workers wearing bright green vests. Those green vests are clue number 2. Nancy Snyder is a spokesperson for the New Jersey Transit. She explains that the extra MTA workers are part of the New Jersey Transit's effort to assist affected customers following the derailment.
We immediately positioned emergency response team representatives at critical station locations to assist customers and promptly provide them with alternate service information.
These response teams seem necessary because as I follow the crowd into Amtrak's main terminal, I hear a woman say,
"I have no idea what's going on."
That's clue number 3. I tried talking to Amtrak officials, and one sent me an email that said, "We apologize for the delays as we work to make these repairs." But an apology doesn't quite cut it for Governor Chris Christie, who criticized Amtrak in a press conference yesterday.
Can the rails be in good enough repair so trains can go over them and not derail? How about we start with that?
The governor has asked New Jersey Transit to halt payments to Amtrak until the company does a better job of keeping up with maintenance repairs.
They got to show us better work than what they're doing. And to have just been out there to inspect those rails less than 10 days ago and then have another derailment in the very same area less than 10 days later is just unacceptable.
For most of the several million commuters that use the New Jersey Transit, delays are frustrating. But one passenger I talked to understood that this is just the reality of mass public transit. Life happens, she said. I just learned to cope. Hannah Long-Higgins, Columbia Radio News.
And now we remember Gilbert Baker. Baker is the man who invented the rainbow flag, the symbol for the LGBTQ movement. He died last Friday at 65. When he created the colorful emblem just under 40 years ago, he had no idea what it would come to stand for. Kristen Schwab has the story about how a handful of stripes became so much more.
The Museum of Modern Art in New York is bursting with famous work. Pablo Picasso, Frida Kahlo, Andy Warhol. Among those is a name you might not recognize, Gilbert Baker. His piece is a cheery addition to the museum's cavernous gray lobby.
So was the original this size?
No, the original was much larger. This is the everyman's version.
That's Michelle Fisher, the curator who helped the museum acquire one of Baker's ubiquitous rainbow flags, which is now the symbol for LGBTQ rights. The version at MoMA is 3 by 5 feet. The original, by some estimates, was 30 by 50 feet. But it didn't hold up. Baker's first rainbow flag was made of cotton and was hand-dyed.
He talks about taking it to a local laundromat and turning each one of the washing machines a different color as they were fixing the dye in there, and they had sort of run out very quickly after that.
Most people are familiar with the rainbow flag. You see it at marches or outside gay bars, but few know how it evolved from yards of fabric to champion symbol to work of art. The flag was commissioned by gay rights leader Harvey Milk in the San Francisco Gay Freedom Day Parade in 1978. Baker was paid $1,000, just enough for materials and supplies. At the time, the gay community had one identifier, and it was not a positive one. Here's Baker on a PBS series a few years ago.
Really, up until the rainbow flag, the pink triangle was the dominant symbol that we used. But it came from the Nazis. It was put on us. And, it had a really horrible negative origin about murder and Holocaust.
Cleve Jones is a known LGBTQ activist and was a close friend of Baker. He helped dye the original flag, and it was messy. It took weeks to wash the colors from his skin. But he says it was worth it, because back then, the gay community needed a positive symbol to help recognize its existence.
It was a very different time then. The people we now call LGBTQ were really beginning to understand how many of us there were, and that was quite still a revelation for us.
Jones helped unveil the flag in front of the UN building in San Francisco that day in June 1978. He says it was a clear blue day, with just enough wind to let the fabric fly.
And you could just see that everybody at that moment was understanding immediately, without any explanation, that this was now our flag and our symbol.
Baker's rainbow flag caught on immediately. Part of that was his ability to grasp this turning point in history, right before the AIDS crisis, when the gay community was coming into its own. But another reason, says MoMA's Michelle Fisher, is that the flag feels universal. It transcends not just sexuality, but gender, race, religion. It's why you'll see people carrying it at all kinds of marches and protests today. And that was multiplied by Baker's desire to share the flag with everyone, even if it meant not making a profit.
I think really importantly, at the crux of it, it was never trademarked. He certainly could have monetized it later on and chose not to.
The version you see today is not quite like the original. It has 6 stripes instead of 8. Pink and turquoise were taken out because the dyes were too expensive for mass production. But the symbolism, that is very much the same. Baker didn't invent the rainbow, but he did reinvent it, and it turned into a political statement. Here's Baker again at the end of the PBS special.
Together, we're changing our world, our planet, from a place of hate and violence and war to a place of love and diversity and acceptance. And that is why we're here. I mean, that's the big long rainbow from before me to well after me.
40 years ago, Baker could not have imagined that this simple flag would someday be hung out of apartment windows in San Francisco, waved defiantly in places like Russia, where peaceful gay rights activism is cause for arrest, or displayed in the lobby of MoMA as art. Kristen Schwab, Columbia Radio News.
Dealing with the death of a friend can be challenging, and everyone says goodbye in their own way. Reporter Lindsay Cordica grapples with unexpected loss.
Sometimes you have a chance to say goodbye to someone, and sometimes you don't. My dad had a heart attack in his late 40s. As he was heading into a quadruple bypass surgery, my mom told us to say goodbye. My dad is fine now, but I learned that there is something to be said about having time to mentally prepare yourself for a goodbye. When I was at Oberlin College in Ohio, I met Alex. He had a sunny personality and rode everywhere on a skateboard. He also loved music, especially playing the flute. We became fast friends. Alex was a neuroscience major, which for me seemed like an impossible major. So much memorization and medical jargon. Even he was worried he wouldn't pass his classes, and he didn't find out that he had passed until the dean handed him his diploma on our graduation day. He moved to Miami, Florida to be near his dad, who is blind and needed help around the house. My family would take frequent trips to Florida, and Alex remained a staple at our family dinners by the beach. When I got engaged to my husband, I threw a bachelorette party in Las Vegas. I invited Alex, the only guy. The photos of us are funny. The girls in black dresses and high heels, and Alex in his suit, beaming. In May 2015, we had a short layover in Miami, but a storm caused our flight to be delayed overnight. I texted Alex to visit the hotel we were staying in. He rode his 2004 Suzuki, a sporty red and yellow motorcycle, to our hotel. Even though I told him it was dangerous, he liked the thrill of riding it around. Alex was like that. He wanted to live life to the fullest, and he didn't mind risk. We sat in the dark at the hotel, talking late into the night. Alex said he liked to talk in the dark because he could really appreciate what people were saying and the sound of their voices. I fell asleep. My husband walked Alex out, and I never said goodbye that night. A few months later, in November, Alex sent me a Snapchat of his motorcycle. He was going to meet a friend for lunch. I didn't see any more snaps from Alex that day, but I didn't think much of it. I didn't realize what had happened until a friend texted me a headline. Motorcyclist, 29, killed in Pines crash, was a physician assistant, accomplished musician. A man drove his car into Alex's lane. He didn't see him. Alex was knocked from his bike and he died. I never really got to say goodbye for real, but I definitely tried. I went to a psychic and asked her to tell Alex goodbye. I was desperate. I don't think it worked. She said Alex was upset because I had to leave his funeral early. It didn't sound like him at all. She did say he's met lots of famous musicians in heaven, which was both kind of weird and kind of comforting at the same time. Now sometimes I will sit and talk to Alex. I ask him for help with things. It was his birthday this week, and I think back to how he used to enjoy listening to voices in the dark. I know that he would appreciate hearing my voice, and that he would know that sometimes at night, in the dark, it is still possible to say goodbye.
That was reporter Lindsay Cordica.
You're listening to Uptown Radio.
There's more to come. Stay with us.
You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Emily Dugdale.
And I'm Catherine Sullivan. Coming up, the day after the United States attacked a Syrian airbase, an unreported oil spill in South Brooklyn is exposed, and climate change threatens New York's salamanders. But first, these headlines.
In New York, I'm Melissa Gossidis. The U.S. military is looking into Russia's role in Syria's chemical weapons attack earlier this week. Officials say the country failed to control the Syrian government's use of chemical weapons. Ambassador Nikki Haley condemned Russia at the United Nations today.
It could be that Russia has been incompetent in its efforts to remove the chemical weapons. Or it could be that the Assad regime is playing the Russians for fools, telling them that there are no chemical weapons, all the while stockpiling them on their bases.
Earlier today, Senator John McCain told MSNBC he supports the recent missile strike against the Syrian airbase.
I think it was appropriate, but I would like to say, despite all the enthusiasm we see this morning, if I might quote Churchill, it's the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end.
In Europe, Stockholm police arrested a suspect in connection with a stolen truck that plowed through a busy street. The truck hit several pedestrians and then crashed into a department store. Swedish media outlets report that at least 4 people died and 12 were injured in the attack. Officials were calling it an act of terrorism. The Senate confirmed Judge Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court today. The confirmation comes after weeks of political infighting. Yesterday, Republicans changed Senate rules to go around opposition by Democrats. The move, known as the nuclear option, helped break the Democratic filibuster and cleared the way for Trump's nominee. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell praised the confirmation.
I think, as we all know, this is a person of extraordinary credentials who will bring honor to the Supreme Court for many, many years to come. So it is indeed a proud day.
Gorsuch is filling the seat left last year by the death of Justice Antonin Scalia. Job numbers are in. The U.S. economy added fewer jobs than expected in March. The government and the private sector added only 98,000 jobs. That number is less than half of what it was this time last year. But many economists say the weather could be partially to blame. This March was colder than normal, and there was a big snowstorm in the Northeast during the time the surveys were compiling data, which may have contributed to the reduction of overall payrolls. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate plunged to 4.5%, the lowest since May 2007. It was a high of 48 degrees today. Tomorrow will be a high of 56, and it'll be sunny throughout the weekend. Melissa Gossidis, Columbia Radio News.
Once again, the Supreme Court has 9 members. Just before noon, the Senate confirmed Colorado Judge Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, making him the 113th justice. But it wasn't without a fight.
Today, I'm talking to Abby Gluck, a law professor at Yale University, about the confirmation. Abby, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So we have a new Supreme Court justice. What happened in the Senate in the past 2 days to allow this vote to go through?
So what happened in the Senate was the triggering of the so-called nuclear option, and that basically meant the Senate changed its own rules to get rid of the filibuster. Very few people understand that the Senate is actually not a majority body. It's a supermajoritarian body, meaning that it takes 60 votes to get anything done in the Senate, because the Senate has had a long-standing rule that requires 60 votes to close debate and move to a vote. Senators can stop that by filibustering, by deciding not to move for a vote. Effectively, it used to be talking a bill to death, but now they don't actually require the senators to do the talking, so it's not actually accurate to call it talking a bill to death. The Senate changed its own rules yesterday, got rid of the filibuster for such nomination, and that allowed them to get the nomination through with fewer than 60 votes, which is what they did.
So can you put this change in context for us? Is there a historical precedent for this? How big of a deal is this?
Well, it has to be fair. It's not just the first time that this has happened. The Democrats, when Obama was president, triggered the nuclear option and got rid of the filibuster for all nominations other than the Supreme Court. You may recall that Obama had a really difficult time getting his lower court judges through the Senate because of the Republicans refusing to bring them to a vote. So they basically brokered a deal saying, we're going to trigger the filibuster, we're going to get rid of the filibuster for lower nominations, but we're going to keep the filibuster for the Supreme Court, recognizing how important the Supreme Court is and how important it is to have moderate, non-extreme candidates on the court. So arguably the Democrats are the ones that really started this ball rolling, and to be fair, Chuck Schumer, when it looked like the Senate might have turned Democrat in this past election, people were talking about the fact that he was likely to go nuclear also. So it's not just a Republican thing, but now that it's happened, chances are it may happen for other parts of the Senate process, including regular lawmaking, right? So right now, it still takes 60 votes to pass a law or to repeal a law, like to repeal the Affordable Care Act, Obama's health care reform law. If the Senate goes nuclear on the legislative stuff too, you're only going to need 50 votes, and then the Republicans are going to be able to do anything they want, and the Democrats' voice is going to be completely silenced.
So what kind of impact will this have for the future of Supreme Court hearings and Senate votes?
Well, I think Supreme Court hearings have pretty much lost most of their content as it is because of the politicization of those hearings. It's unlikely that this is going to make Supreme Court nominees feel more free to sort of state their real views on the theory that, hey, we can get through no matter what. I think that's unlikely. I think we're going to see the same kind of Supreme Court hearings we see now. We may see more grassroots opposition before candidates are even announced, if it's impossible for the minority to stop them going in. But it does give the Republicans an enormous amount of power. They now can really control all three branches of government, and there's very little the Democrats can do at this point to stop something that goes through when the Republicans are unified. And the thing I just point out is it's important to recognize that before today, even if the Republicans were unified, there were not 60 Republicans in the Senate. So the Senate Democrats actually had a lot of power to stop things from getting through Congress. If the Republicans take this step they took today and keep going with it and stop the filibuster for the regular legislative process, there's nothing the Democrats are going to be able to do.
Abby, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
New York is home to lots of districts: the Diamond District, the Flower District, the Financial District. And then there's the Garment District, which spans 8 blocks of Midtown West. During the 1980s, around 30,000 people worked there. Today, that number has dwindled to 5,000. And now the region, known by many as the creative hub of the fashion industry, is facing another hurdle: rezoning. Melissa Casares reports.
Teddy Sadaka has been in the clothing business since he was a teenager in the 1970s. Back when his parents started Apparel Production Incorporated, this factory on 39th Street. And Sadaka says blood, sweat, and tears have gone into it. Literally.
I have this scar on my finger right here, right? You see the scar there?
He points to a thin white line on his right hand.
That's the needle that went into my finger.
When he was 15, Sadaka was sewing a button on some fabric, and he stuck his finger with a long needle.
So I pulled it out, threw it on the floor, and I cursed my brains out. But put a Band-Aid on it and go back to putting buttons on.
Now, he owns the factory. Sadaka greets one of the dozen or so Chinese seamstresses.
Hey, ni hao.
He walks past the rows of machinery to get to the only machine that's idle.
This is a shoulder pad machine that's only for jackets. So it's sitting here waiting for a jacket order.
It might be a while. New York City is proposing to rezone the garment district and allow different businesses to come in. Sadaka's sister and co-owner Karen Sadaka says to garment workers, the city's attempt to restructure is aggressive.
The real bottom line is they're looking to take our real estate, put it into offices, condos, whatever it is, and take the industry and basically eliminate it.
But at a recent hearing, city planners say they're not trying to push anyone out. They say they want to diversify the area. Elliot Sklar is a professor of urban planning at Columbia. He says now, more than ever, space in Manhattan is scarce. And it makes sense the city would be looking for ways to bring in wealthier businesses.
Because of this fiscal pressure and the fact that the only thing the city has left that it can really leverage and sell is upzoning.
And Sklar says the garment district faces more pressures, not just from the city. The district has been losing jobs overseas for years.
Most of the mass-produced garments, Bell, have been made Pakistan, India, the Philippines, you name it. The low-wage end of that and the mass production of garments has disappeared.
He says what New York has maintained is the connection to high-end fashion, and the city is offering garment companies lease space in Brooklyn. But that would mean being far away from local designers.
Hi, I'm Katie Laris, and I am a handbag designer.
Laris sells her bags through a luxury designer collective in Lower Manhattan called Flying Solo. She says she relies on the garment district for pretty much all of her supplies, and it helps to have everything in one place.
Most of our days are spent just zigzagging through the garment district. Like, we're in the factory making something. We have to go get a thread. We go to Sil Thread. We have to go get some hardware. We go to Botani. And that's what the whole day is like.
Having everything nearby, that's a district. Back at Apparel Production Incorporated, Teddy Sadaka looks over one of his workers sewing layers of fabric together.
That sound is money. And I guess at dairy farmer, the same thing. When he hears, when he hears the cow mooing, it's money for him. So that's money for me, this sound.
And Sadaka says he hopes he can keep his business afloat, no matter what ends up happening with the rezoning. Melissa Cáceres, Columbia Radio News.
Spring has almost sprung, and that means the sounds of New York's parks are about to change. Think robins, spring peepers, oh, and cyclists on your left.
There are also some much teenier residents who come out this time of year, salamanders. And as Pia Peterson reports, they're an especially important indicator for the health of New York City's forests and water.
Ellen Pehek is in Alley Pond Park in Far East Queens with waders and 2 giant nets looking for evidence of salamanders.
I'm not finding any tadpoles.
They're proving hard to find, but Pehek doesn't mind. She could do this all night. She's the ecologist with New York City's Parks and Rec, and she loves salamanders. It's perfect salamander weather. Wet, rainy, and above 40 degrees. These are the ideal conditions for salamanders to come out of hibernation and migrate.
We haven't come up totally empty. We found a red-backed salamander.
It's beautiful, dark gray with a red stripe running down its back. But that's one salamander, for the night. Pehek can tell a lot about the health of parks by their salamanders. Amphibians are important indicator species for the health of New York's forests and waterways. Their skin is porous, and they're easily affected by contaminants or temperature changes. In winter, they hibernate underground. Come April, they emerge and lay their eggs in vernal pools, seasonal wetlands filled with rain and snowmelt. When an April night like this comes along, there's usually a mass migration, thousands of frogs and salamanders all moving from their hibernation spots to these vernal pools at once. This year, abnormally warm weather in February, followed by snowstorms, disrupted that routine and lured many amphibians out before it was time.
One of the problems with small populations is that these erratic weather events wipe out huge segments of the population. Last year was a really bad year.
Last year, there was a drought. If salamanders can't find a vernal pool to lay their eggs, they start walking, up to a quarter mile, the equivalent of 1,500 miles for a human. They can face roads, predators, or other obstacles. Across New York State, some places have begun using volunteers to help the salamanders. They go out on rainy spring nights, counting and ferrying the amphibians across the roads on laminated sheets of paper.
All right, I think I see a bunch ahead. Got the sheets, flashlight.
Lori Husted and her son Ethan are patrolling the roads in Red Hook, New York.
All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Oh my.
This is a baby. This is about 1 inch long. Oh, look at him.
The volunteers collect important data that helps scientists track the population. If the salamanders move early because of erratic weather, well, they can lose a lot more than just data. Laura Heedy helps organize volunteer efforts as the Biodiversity Outreach Coordinator for the New York Department of Environmental Conservation.
I mean, I've had lots of questions from volunteers asking what's going to happen to the wood frogs that already moved into the pools, or the salamanders that already moved to the pools, or the egg masses that were already laid.
Some amphibians and their eggs won't survive. This is a symptom of one of the larger problems looming for these populations, climate change. If enough years go by with unpredictable weather, either drought or unprecedented bouts of warming and cold snaps, they could be in danger for the long term. Daniel Rosenblatt is a biologist at the New York State Department of Conservation. He says that if you're using water in New York City, you should care about the salamanders.
Those same reservoirs and aquifers that provide the water to New York City provide the best examples of intact habitat for species such as the salamanders that we're talking about today. So even though they might not have salamanders in their backyard, the fact that there's good high-quality salamander habitat upstream from New York City is paying dividends every time they're drinking clean water out of the tap.
So we'll come back and check later.
Back in Alley Pond Park in Queens, the ecologist Ellen Pahek is still on the lookout.
And just have to keep checking because we won't know if they're still here. We have to keep looking.
Any problem for salamanders could turn into a problem for us, too. Which is why folks like Ellen Pahek are working so hard to keep an eye out for any major shifts. Pia Peterson, Columbia Radio News.
Elected officials and activists gathered in South Brooklyn this morning to draw attention to a recent environmental disaster. Last week, 27,000 gallons of oil spilled into the Gravesend Bay, and nobody was notified about it. The bay is a popular spot for bathing, and fish from the bay go to markets all over the New York metro region. Residents are concerned the oil would pollute the water and endanger the wildlife. While the impact of the spill is still being investigated, locals are outraged that neither the public nor elected officials were notified about it. Shusmita Pathak reports.
Caesars Bay Palace is just a regular suburban mall, but it has a beautiful view. Stand in the parking lot and you can see the Verrazano Bridge in the distance, and the gray water of Gravesend Bay shimmering in the sunlight. It's hard to imagine that just last Friday, thousands of gallons of diesel spilled into the water here. But even more surprising, no one seems to know about it. Like Frankie Liu, who's here to do some shopping.
Have you heard anything about the oil spill?
Oil spill?
Yeah.
It's the first time heard of it. I didn't even know.
And that's what other shoppers say too, until half an hour later when Michael Silverman arrives. He's president of the Warbus Houses, a nearby housing cooperative.
We didn't hear about it. We didn't hear from the parties, the departments that are supposed to be telling us about it.
Silverman says he heard about the spill, eventually, from local activists on a blog. And now he's here for a press conference hosted by Councilman Mark Trieger, who's here along with other elected officials and concerned residents to demand some answers.
What happened here? How will it never happen again? How will the bad actors be held responsible? And what remediation efforts are underway?
What's more, Silverman says, this isn't the first time the Department of Environmental Conservation has failed to notify officials or the public about an environmental hazard.
A few months ago, DEC came down to a meeting where they acknowledged that they failed to notify us about 200,000 gallons of raw, untreated sewage being dumped into Coney Island Creek on a daily basis.
The DEC is holding a Bensonhurst-based company, Bayside Fuel Oil Depot Corporation, accountable for the spill. The company confirmed the spill, but challenged its extent. It also said it wasn't its responsibility to report the spill to politicians or the public. At the press conference, City Comptroller Scott Stringer said over the past 5 decades, the company has had 7 oil spills. And he says other companies have had spills too.
I am asking my audit investigation unit to commence a top-to-bottom review of procedures as it relates to communication, as it relates to cleanup, as it relates to holding these oil companies accountable.
The oil from the spill has been cleaned up, but residents are waiting to see how bad investigators say the damage is. Sushmita Pathak, Columbia Radio News.
When you think of the 1920s in New York City, jazz may come to mind. But jazz isn't the only art form that the Roaring Twenties brought to life. The creative decade inspired innovative interior design, architecture, and fashion. A new exhibit at the Cooper Hewitt Museum shows off the unique American style of the Jazz Age. Camila Kudelska reports.
When you enter the museum, the soft notes of jazz float through the room. It's the opening day of the newest exhibit called The Jazz Age, American Style in the 1920s. Judith Gura is a design historian. She says it was a time when Americans were just starting to explore and exchange ideas across the Atlantic.
The 1920s is really the first time that America began to be open to influence from abroad, partly because it was the time when Americans started to travel, and also we had Europeans who were coming to live in America and designing here.
In the middle of the room is one of the artworks. It's a room screen that stands about 5 feet tall. It has silver leaf decorations with a gold figure in the middle, in front of a blue background. Looking at this artwork stands a tall, lean, white-haired man, and he's telling the woman next to him all about the design of the screen.
Actually, this is silver plate over steel with a gilded figure, leaf motif on the two vertical columns, and the center one is sort of an undulating earth motif.
That's Bob Rose. The reason why he knows so much about this particular iconic Art Deco piece? He's the grandson of the craftsman. His grandfather was Martin Rose. He was born in Hungary, and he learned his craft there. But in 1904, Martin moved to Cleveland. Bob Rose says his grandfather was able to take advantage of the innovative era.
But as the Jazz Age started, the whole design sense was changing. My grandfather wanted to participate in anything new, and it was a really exciting era.
Bob Rose's grandfather is a great example of the Jazz Age in America. The mix of cultures in the country created the unique American style. Susan Coffin is the curator of the exhibition.
Why I called it Melting Pot Modern is that I feel that it is a unique American expression, taking these different threads and having multiple design styles that have interconnectedness.
And Americans took this unique style to another level that allowed the design to stay popular for the next couple of decades, says Coffin.
The fact that Americans love mass market, mass production techniques that the French found so abhorrent was in fact what made the modern movement the predominant style of the 30s, because it was an affordable style.
Back in the exhibit, Bob Rose is almost done. He's moved to the jewelry section. It's his first time seeing all this work together.
To see it in conjunction with items of all different types, I mean, everything from jewelry to clothing to furniture here, it's a rare opportunity to get a feel for that whole couple decades.
Rose is a craftsman himself, continuing his grandfather's business. He says design has changed a lot since his grandfather's time, and it's important to look back at those earlier periods. And that's exactly what's happening at the Cooper Hewitt Museum through August. Camila Kudelska, Columbia Radio News.
Now let's think about your internet browsing history. On Tuesday, President Trump signed a law that allows internet service providers to sell your online activity to the highest bidder. Many folks are responding by signing up for a virtual private network, or VPNs, to mask their online activity. But, as Devin Brisky reports, that may have risk too.
If you've ever visited Zappos shoes online, you may have noticed something. Ads for specific shoes start showing up everywhere. They're now on your Facebook page or when you're reading NewYorkTimes.com. Zappos follows you. Joe Weaver is an expert in digital advertising.
Every time that you put something in your cart, or you click on a shoe to see a description, or you click on the different sizes to see what are available, or the different colors, every single action that you take is usually tracked by something that we would call a cookie.
Companies buy and sell data they collect from cookies a lot. Websites selling info about your online activity is not new, but Weaver says now that internet service providers can sell your data too, well, that's a bigger deal.
The pipe that comes into your home through your internet service provider is one of the only pipes that carries data that really allows a company to really understand who you are and what you do. because they have the most complete view of you as a consumer.
That has made privacy advocates very worried, and it's meant huge sales of VPNs, or virtual private networks. If you use a VPN, all of your internet activity is directed to a remote server and encrypted. Traffic for the site Viper VPN increased 70% last week. Sunday Yokubaitis is the president of Viper VPN.
Because when you use a VPN, your entire internet traffic is going through our server. So you have to really trust who you're using. You have to really look into that company.
Because here's what might surprise you. The VPN market is completely unregulated, and now it has all your data. Some call it the Wild West of the internet.
Anybody with a server in a dorm room can go stand up a VPN and start taking Bitcoin for it.
That's Kevin Riggle. He's a cybersecurity expert who studied the terms of service of VPN contracts.
And I do think that we're seeing a lot of scammy or incompetent players coming into the market because there is this demand.
One study by a leading computer science professional organization found nearly 1 out of 5 VPN apps doesn't offer any kind of active protection for your online activity. One major red flag: if a VPN service is offered free of charge.
You've maybe heard the saying that if you're not paying for something, you're the product rather than the customer. That is extremely true of free VPN services.
VPNs can sell your private data, and many do. Ernesto Falcon is a digital rights lawyer at the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
VPNs can make pledges to respect your privacy, but those pledges have to be enforceable under law, and the law will depend on where they're located.
If your VPN is located in a foreign country, you may have no legal recourse for fraud or worse.
You have another country's set of laws and data practices and privacy invasive methods that may exist, but you have no say and no control over.
So if you do decide to install a VPN, do your research. Read the terms of service. And if you don't want your data being sold to advertisers, Riggle says the best course of action may be to just contact your internet service provider and tell them you don't want them to sell your data. Devin Brisky, Columbia Radio News.
We all have parts of our lives that we want to forget. Bad relationships, embarrassing moments, uncomfortable experiences. But as Meg Dalton has learned, sometimes it's important that we remember.
When I look at my stomach, I see a map. Roots made up of stretch marks from a time when I was much heavier. Close to 100 pounds heavier. Each mark takes me to a different memory. The 5-inch long one curving along my belly button, that takes me back to my high school cafeteria, where I sat alone every day, head buried in a Harry Potter book. The short pink ones speckling the small of my back, those lead to my bedroom, where I would stuff candy wrappers in a box under my bed so my parents wouldn't realize I was binge eating again. And the stripes, like lightning bolts marking my hips. Those pull me into the Old Navy dressing room, where I struggled to squeeze into a pair of size 22 jeans. Growing up, I was never a small kid, but my weight ballooned to 267 pounds during my sophomore year of high school, and that meant my skin stretched to its limits. Deep, jagged stretch marks carved themselves into my skin. They looked like tiger stripes, and they were everywhere. Up and down my torso, running along the sides of my body, sprinkled on my inner thighs. Those discolored scars, some a blush of purple or faded red, others semi-translucent. When I committed to lose the weight, I lost it pretty fast. Most of it between my junior and senior years of college. I started walking everywhere, around the hilly campus, to my internship in a neighboring town, to my part-time job down the street. I also took control of my eating habits. I became a vegetarian. I discovered Trader Joe's, an affordable and relatively healthy option, and I started buying my own groceries for the first time in my life. The stretch marks didn't bother me as much when I was fat, but when I lost the weight, they tormented me. I looked at them every single day, and they told me awful stories. That I was damaged goods, that I was worthless, that I could never, ever be loved. The same stories my brain told me when I was fat. I lost pounds, but not the way of growing up in a culture that told me I was lazy and repulsive and wrong. I needed to erase the stretch marks, to destroy the evidence of a life I wanted to forget. I bought all sorts of creams and lotions, shea butter, cocoa butter, collagen, you name it, I tried it. When those didn't work, I took my efforts online. My research told me that laser treatment was the only permanent option, but it wasn't. Not for me and my empty wallet. There was nothing I could do, except maybe learn how to live with my stretch marks. Today, they're lighter and smoother. I still look at them every single morning. I don't think they're beautiful, and I don't have to ever. My stretch marks still tell me stories, but they're stories of how far I've come. Embracing them is a daily struggle, but I remind myself they're souvenirs from a long, painful, and complex journey. And then I tell myself, I've earned my stripes.
You can find Meg Dalton roaming the aisles of Trader Joe's in the Upper West Side. Well, that does it for today's broadcast of Uptown Radio. We hope you enjoyed the show.
Our executive producer today was Acacia O'Connor. Our senior producer, Mike Elson-Rooney, worked with Taylor Wisner and Camila Kerwin.
Senior editor Rebecca Scott and assistant editor Lindsay Cortica led our copy team.
Director Devin Brisky coordinated our studio production with Christian Schwab and Max Hauptmann.
Our web team, Pia Peterson and Sarah Gibson, got this stream live to the web.
Radio professors Carrie Donahue, Joe Richmond, Sally Hershup, and Osa Secker advised our staff. I'm Catherine Sullivan.
And I'm Emily Dugdale. Uptown Radio is live on Fridays at 4. Until next week, you can always find us on uptownradio.org. From all of us here at Uptown Radio, thanks for listening.